Hello, everyone. This is True Believers. I'm James Heyer, and this is Enrique Ramirez.
Hello.
And tonight we have a special guest. George Lawson is with us.
Good evening.
George, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good, as always.
And we've been trying, I think, since our second episode to get you on here. And the planets aligned, and we finally got you to sit down and talk with us for a long time. What's funny is, I was going to tell this story of how I've worked with you. Our jobs have collided every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
And I think when the new 52 came out, there were a few of us over there gathered by the new stuff, like looking at, what we want to pick up. And, there's a bunch of people there. And then I look over the door, and I see a familiar face. And then I look out in the parking lot, and I was like, wait a sec, there's that guy's work car. Hey, that's George Lawson. George, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, hey, how's it going? And that's kind of when we figured out you were a comic book guy, and then ever since then we've kind of talked about comic books. And one thing I found fascinating, I'm going to ask you right now, is the New 52 came out about, 2 years ago?
Yeah, close to 2 years, because they're up to issue 20 now.
Yeah. And have you read one issue of Superman yet?
Not yet.
Not
But it's time. I've been letting books pile up, not just comic books, but a lot of books. And I've got piles of books at home that I've just got to get after. And I've always loved books in general. So, the comic book started me off on a lot of other books and on reading in general. So, and I've gotten to the habit now where I just let things stack up for a little bit, and then I sit down and read them all at once. And I'm glad I did that with one issue, and maybe we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But,
all right, very good.
It's sometimes it's just finding the time in a busy schedule.
And I think I find that fascinating because, like me, I'm like a little kid at Christmas, or I get that comic book, I'll go read it in my car before I even drive off or something. I'll read it as long as it takes me, and I'll sit there and read it. But like to have the patience to wait 2 years to read the new Superman, yeah. I applaud you for that.
Well, I did that with the Death of Superman when they had all those issues that came out. When was that? 92 or whenever that was.
Something like that, yeah.
And also the Nightfall storyline with Batman. And I don't collect Superman and Batman on a regular basis, but when they have these big storylines and that get a lot of attention, I grabbed those up and grabbed them all, waited till I had them all, and then sat down and read them. And it was like reading a novel or something like that.
And that makes sense to me to do something like that.
And it was easier, I think, in some ways to do that instead of having to wait until next week. Although, I think these issues came out every week at that point.
Oh wow! So because right now we're at a month to get the new Batman and Superman and all that stuff. So
yeah.
Let's start off at the beginning. You've been collecting comic books since you were a kid, and you're picking up the mags that we're making fun of and reading the mail out in the back.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Kind of tell me what got you interested in where you're from and how did you get comic books?
Well, there's a Kansas connection to that. I was growing up in a town of Wewoka, Oklahoma, and I had an aunt who lived in northwest Oklahoma, north of Alva, near the town of Capron, and she worked at a drugstore in Hartner, Kansas. And she would get to pick up all these comic books and magazines and paperbacks that the drugstore was getting rid of, and she'd bring them to us in boxes. And they would have the top third of the cover torn off because I guess they had to send that back to the distributor for credit. I think the paperback books had the entire cover gone. So there were books that were thrown out, and I guess, back in the 60s, they didn't really know about collectability and all of that. So it's a shame that they ended up trashing books like that. But I got all kinds of comic books, the DC, Marvels, Archies. I think there were Dell or Gold Key comics, and of course I like the Marvels the best. Mm-hmm. And a comic book that you guys talked about on this show a few weeks ago, I think was the first Amazing Spider-Man that I ever read. It was issue number 14.
Yeah.
I still remember that cover with the top third torn off. And I think they had the little box with the Hulk down in the lower right, and because he made a guest appearance in it. And I enjoyed reading that, and I read, I think, a couple of early X-Men books, I think with Eunice and the Blob, issues 7 and 8, or whatever those issues turn out to be. And so I ended up collecting and learning about comics that way. And then one day I walked into a store in Wewoka. It was a little town grocery store called the Green Spray. and it had wooden floors. It was almost like, you know, small town grocery store,
Oh, nice.
general store type thing, and they had a comic rack in there. And I went in there and bought X-Men number 11, featuring the Stranger.
Oh, wow.
And I remember that issue very well, and didn't buy X-Men on a regular basis, but a few after that. And then Spider-Man number 25 I remember buying there, and I bought 26, missed 27, which was the second part of that story, aggravating to no end. I think I moved to Oklahoma City about that time, so that might have been why. And then
And back then you didn't have the internet, or you
No.
just didn't know what happened.
no, and so that was part of the culture growing up, and I'll tell you, it was amazing growing up in the 60s from a cultural standpoint, because we had top 40 radio with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, British Invasion, all these rock groups. We had all these great TV shows like Dark Shadows and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and Secret Agent, and so many more shows. And we had John Wayne and Robert Mitchum and Kirk Douglas in movie theaters. We had Sean Connery as James Bond in theaters. And we had Marvel Comics on the newsstand. So what more could you want?
I know.
Now, George, I don't want to age you at this, but how old were you at this time?
I was probably about 7 or 8 when I started getting into comics. And I think maybe around that time, X-Men came out 62, 63 maybe. So it was right around that time that I started buying comics and finding them in the grocery store, and occasionally drugstores had them too. It never saw a comic book store until much later. And in fact, the comic store here in Wichita I discovered pretty much after moving here in '89. So it was a very different world to step into from the usual sources of buying books.
What are some of your favorites? Like, what ones were like, you know, when you were a kid and just kind of grew with you, like until now? What are some of the ones you still pick up and enjoy reading?
Well, I still read some Marvels. Amazing Spider-Man, although it's called Superior Spider-Man now.
Wow.
Iron Man, and Captain America I've been off and on with. Fantastic Four. Didn't start with them so much early, but then picked them up later and really started getting into Fantastic Four. One of the things was their stories were usually 4, 5, 6, 7 parts long.
No.
And I always hated missing an issue and just never started Fantastic Four until much later. But some very good stories, very wonderful stories, and that they lived up to their title of the world's greatest comic magazine when they started getting into like the 20s and 30s and 40s numbering on their issues.
Oh, yeah.
And
Now, I don't know if you had, like, right now, like, you know, when I was a kid, my mom was like, stop reading comic books. Now, like, my wife's telling me, you know, stop reading comic books. I mean, and you're older than me. You grew up in the 60s. Is your wife still giving you a hard time about reading comics? And why won't you stop reading comics?
No, not really. I don't think my folks liked my reading comics too much, but they didn't interfere with it too much. And of course, the thing was, you know, back then comics were 12 cents, and I'd get $1 a week for an allowance, and I could take that $1 and buy 7 or 8 comic books with it. And then one day I walked into a drugstore around 1970, and they'd gone up to 15 cents, and I had to leave a book on the shelf. That was frustrating, because I couldn't.
Leave 1 out of 12.
Yeah.
I had to get 11 instead of 12.
Yeah. So, and I was buying probably about a dozen or so comic books a month, and plus the 25-cent comic books, which were Marvel's Greatest Comics, which reprinted Fantastic Four, and Marvel Tales, which reprinted Spider-Man, and sometimes they had original stories in them too, and they had some interesting stories that came out in the 60s. There was a Captain Marvel that they put out in the 60s who was an alien from a race they'd already introduced in Fantastic Four. So they carried over as kind of a spin-off of Fantastic Four.
Oh, wow.
And he was an alien who came to Earth. He took the name Walter Lawson. And
so you gravitated toward that, I imagine.
Well, it looked interesting, and he was from the Kree. You may have heard of the Kree if you've read Marvel Comics. And he was here to scout Earth for, I guess, invasion. And he ends up becoming this hero. So, and then of course the character continued on for quite a while.
Oh, wow.
And they had some interesting wrinkles that they added to it there. So So that was one of the original stories that they came out with. And then they had a comic, a 25-cent comic called Fantasy Masterpieces, and they reprinted some of the early Captain Americas from the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
And got a chance to read a few of those. And they're putting some of those out now in hardback and in softcover as well. So it's good to be able to catch up and see the real early days of comic books.
Yeah, exactly. I had another question here, and it just kind of, what do you have, like a garage or a basement just full of comics? Were you able to keep most of these when you were?
No, I lost a bunch of them at one point in time, and don't have a lot of the ones that I had when I was a kid. I kind of started over in the 90s, and I've got a few boxes of them at the house now, and nothing that's really all that valuable. Of course, the bottom kind of dropped out of the collecting market in the 90s when people realized that, hey, everybody and his dog has got a copy of this, and if they all try to sell it at once, it's not going to be worth so much.
No.
And yeah, there were people who thought they could buy a comic book or two and hang on to it for 20 years and finance college with it.
Nope.
It didn't work out that way. Maybe at one time it would have.
Yeah, exactly.
But the reason why a lot of comics are valuable is because they're rare. And a lot of people growing up in the 60s, they ended up throwing them out, or their mothers threw them out. And they didn't realize, they just didn't realize that there'd be a value, especially if there weren't very many copies left.
Exactly. Now people are buying him and bagging him up and putting away in their basement, and like you said, hoping they'll be worth something. Not really.
And yeah, not really, because 400,000 copies out there, and
yeah, exactly.
every one of them still probably out there.
Exactly. Now we're getting into the movie genre of like the Avengers and Thor and all that. Back then when you were a kid, you've seen them, haven't you? Yeah. Have you ever imagined that, like back in the day, that you'd be able to see these on the big screen?
No, it was hard to imagine back then. You kept hoping, and there were some TV shows that came out in the 70s and 80s that they had a Spider-Man and Hulk TV series in the 80s that were pretty decent. Weren't really based that closely on the comic book. When I was growing up in the 60s, the DC characters, Superman and Batman, really were a part of American culture. And they had the Batman TV series in '66. And Marvel was just kind of like number two. And, maybe a little well known, but they weren't ingrained in the culture like they are today. And longevity really helps with that. And they were too new in the 60s. And there were a few marketing things that came out, and you'd see the Marvel characters every so often here and there. I did finally see there was a Captain America movie serial that was made by Republic in 1944. I discovered the movie serials in the early 60s, stumbled into the middle of one on one Saturday afternoon in Oklahoma when I was bored and cartoons were over. And I tuned into the middle of this movie where they were taking film of a giant crayfish in the African jungle. And I still remember that. That was the serial Panther Girl of the Congo, made in 1954. And it starred Phyllis Coates, and she played Lois Lane in the first season of Adventures of Superman. Highly recommended. If you've never seen that, you need to see that, at least that first season. It's got 4 seasons out. It was in syndication.
Oh, wow.
George Reeves playing Superman, and Phyllis Coates played Lois Lane, did a heck of a job. And she couldn't continue with the series. They filmed it in 1951, and it didn't show up until about 1953. And then they decided they wanted another season, second season. And Phyllis Coates wasn't available for one reason or another. And so they got Noel Neal, who had played Lois Lane in a couple of movie serials for Columbia. And those are on DVD, by the way. But Republic made a Captain America serial. I first learned of it on a Marvel calendar, and they had a little picture from it in the late 60s, and always wanted to see that, and finally did around 1980 or so when they put it on video cassette.
Oh, wow.
And again, not based very closely on the comic book. I mean, instead of being an Army private named Steve Rogers, he's a district attorney named Grant Gardner. and there's a lot of fisticuffs, and he doesn't have the shield, and there's no Bucky. He uses a gun. But it was entertaining. I think it's one of my favorite Republic serials, if you can get past, the changes they made in the character. And a couple of companies have put it out on DVD here and there. So I hope you guys get a chance to see it.
I like stuff like that. Yeah.
But I just love the movie serials, and I got hooked on them as a kid, rediscovered them in college in the 70s on another TV station, and then they started coming out on video cassette, and now there are some out on DVD, and that's a whole history in itself.
Exactly.
That we might have to get into a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, I just saw on TV the Shield trailer.
Mm-hmm.
And that looked really good, actually. Hopefully they keep up with the high budget. It looks like it's going to have a huge budget, and they bring back Agent Coulson, and I think that's going to be great, especially for ABC. And I still think myself that they could do an Incredible Hulk series like they did with Bill Bixby. They could do that today.
Yeah.
I think that could happen.
Yeah.
They've talked about that, I think, for ABC at one point.
I think you're right, yeah.
I don't know if that's still in the works.
I'd be nice.
But it'll be interesting to see what they do with Agent Coulson, since he had a rather final
Yeah.
occurrence in Avengers. But
Yeah.
will they bring him back, or does this take place before?
Exactly.
So that'll be interesting. Of course, S.H.I.E.L.D. has life model decoys, if you remember that,
Yeah.
so maybe that's what got...
No one really dies in the comic books.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting ready to read a letter, the Spider's webmail, and I kind of ruined it, but we let you choose which one you wanted to read from, and
Right.
kind of tell us which one it is and why you picked that one.
Well, this is Amazing Spider-Man issue number 30, and it has a very distinctive cover, very different from what you usually see on a comic book. It's got Spider-Man clinging to the side of a wall, and this water tower is coming down. Looks like it's going to come down on top of him. And Spider-Man is just very reduced in size on this cover. You almost have to have a magnifying glass to see him. And it's just a long-range action shot here that they put on. Very unusual for a cover. You get a glimpse of the villain, and then they have the logo at the upper left with Marvel Pop Art Productions, which they used for a while in the late 60s.
And what is the pop? Because I see it, I've only seen it on a couple of these. What is the pop art?
Well, I think that was kind of a term and a kind of a concept that really came to being in the 60s. I think you had the artist Peter Max, who did some wild psychedelic artwork in the 60s, and I think Marvel was just trying to capitalize on that, and for a while they called their comics pop art productions, and they wanted to be seen as pop art, and I guess to be cool. Mm-hmm. So I guess they wanted to get in on that trend. So this was the fourth Spider-Man comic that I ever bought, and I bought this in Oklahoma City when I was living there, and it's just a distinctive cover. The villain doesn't have superpowers. He's an interesting kind of villain. And there are some things in this story that kind of set up the next three issues, which is a classic story, a classic three-part story in Spider-Man history.
Is that what you liked about Spider-Man? Kind of tell us why.
Well, I think the thing about the Marvel characters is they were three-dimensional. They had personal problems. They were more real, lifelike characters. They didn't live two-dimensional lives. They were very complicated lives. Their lives were made problematic by the fact that they were a superhero, or that they had superpowers. I mean, the Fantastic Four bickered among themselves, and you know, the Thing would get mad and quit every 10 issues or so. And,
I'm out of here.
And so it was. I think the dimension of the characters and the writing, and it's a very dramatic, almost soap opera type of writing that I think really stood out.
Oh yeah.
From a lot of comic books, there was more to these stories, and of course Marvel continued to improve on story writing and artwork, and you had the sense that comic books were growing up with you, as we read them through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. So we had read stories that a lot of college kids were reading Marvel comics. Mm-hmm. So we weren't alone, you know. It's and a lot of people were getting into them. So,
well, cool.
So, and this particular issue is one of the early ones I remember buying off the rack, and I thought, well, it's a very interesting story, and it's kind of a turning point for Peter Parker, because his relationship with Betty Brant comes to kind of an end here.
Yeah.
And that was always kind of an interesting relationship, because he's a high school kid and she's a working girl. Yeah. So what's the age difference here?
Well, he's Spider-Man.
And, well, she doesn't know that, though.
He knows.
But that's what drives them apart in this issue. And the fact that he's Spider-Man, but he can't tell her,
Right,
obviously.
right. Oh.
So it was, there was just a lot more to these characters and these stories.
Yeah.
And it was appealing also to see some of them go into continued stories for 2 or 3 issues.
I still find it fascinating that, you know, these were made so long ago and they're still churning them out every day. I mean, just I've tried to read as many of these as I can, and it's still there. It seems like you just get different artists, different writers, but it still holds up today. Like you can't say that about a lot of movies or even music. But these comic books are still, most of them are still holding up. And keep your attention with the story and the art, and so much so that they're making, you know, big budget movies out of them. So I just find it fascinating.
And you can go back and read them and reread them and still enjoy them. And the stories of the 60s are still relevant today in a lot of ways.
Oh, right.
And the 70s too. And I think nothing really beats the output that Marvel had in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And they seem to have a lot of different books that were coming out. And I mentioned the 12-cent and the 25-cent comics. Yeah. And there were other comics too, I mean, that were fun to read.
Oh yeah. But you stuck with Marvel, Spider-Man,
and a few others from time to time. So
now, did you pick up something that would just catch your eye, or are you one of those types, like kind of impulsive, like, oh, this is a cool cover, I'll check this one out? Or...
I think it was really more about, you know, what the book was about, and you know, I was familiar with Spider-Man, X-Men, some of those comics.
I mean, did you follow artists, or did you follow, or did that mean anything to you? Like, some people are like diehard, you know, Ditko fans or Jim Lee fans, and they'll pick up whatever they put out. And, you know, from what you're saying, it's just the storyline. If it interested you, you'd pick it up.
The character and the storyline. And I did keep up with artists too, and that's one thing Stan Lee gets a lot of credit for. I mean, he put the credits on the front page and told you who drew the story and who wrote it, who lettered it, and you got to know these names of the people in the Marvel bullpen. And other comic books, you might barely see a signature on a story, or maybe no credit at all as to who wrote it.
Wow.
And some of the Gold Key comics, for example, I don't know if they ever gave credit to their artists and writers. Russ Manning was an artist who did Magnus Robot Fighter for Gold Key, and I enjoyed reading those books in the 60s. They put those out in hardback and softcover. And they also had Space Family Robinson, which later on, when the Lost in Space TV series came out, they put Lost in Space on the cover for a while, trying to capitalize on that, even though the TV series was not really based on the comic book. The character, it was a different Robinson family in the comic as opposed to the TV series. But they tried to capitalize on that a bit. And some interesting stories, and those were generally one-shot stories. They'd tell a complete story in one issue. Maybe occasionally there'd be a carryover into the next issue.
Yeah.
Kind of a continued story, but generally they'd tell a story in one issue. And Dr. Solar, Man of the Atom, was a good one too for Gold Key. And they've reprinted a lot of these in hardbacks, and you can find them online, on Amazon, and a lot of places.
And you've picked up a lot of these. You said you picked, like, you've got your Spider-Man and stuff like that on CD-ROM, DVD-ROM. You like that better, like having something on a, you know, because that's kind of in debate right now. You know, people that still like to go to the comic book shop, pick up something, and have it in their hands, you know, to read and collect. And most people, you know, like the digital comics, and I still like the one in my hand. I like having it in my hand, a physical book.
Yeah, well, the CD-ROM and the DVD-ROM are nice. It's like having a comic book collection in your computer. You can click on the issue and look at it from cover to cover. I've gotten some of the Marvel Masterworks books in hardback where they print, you know, 10 issues of a series, and I've got like the first 90 or so issues of Fantastic Four that way. But you don't get the ads and the letters pages and all the extra stuff with it, and those are kind of nostalgic to look at too.
Oh yeah, we've poked fun at a few of those.
Well, for instance, there's one right here, the Grit.
The Grit
ads.
newspaper, Sell Grit.
See those all the time.
And win prizes, and you can send off for things, and
Now, did you send off for a monkey, George?
I sent off for a space army one time out of a comic book ad, and it was a interesting little drawing of two armies meeting in space, and I finally got it. And of course, I can't remember how much it was, maybe $1 or $2 back then, because inflation, you pay a lot more for that today. But I got a box of all these soldier characters, and they came with helmets and belts and ray guns, and you could outfit them. And there were these other characters that were supposed to be aliens, I guess, and that was back in '63 or '64 when I got that. Had a lot of fun with that.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine.
But that's about the only thing I think I've ever ordered from a.
Not a monkey or
not one of the monkeys.
Sea monkeys.
Never decided to sell grit or anything.
No.
Or take what's that muscle dude's name?
Oh,
Joe Wider.
Mike Marvel.
Mike Marvel.
Mike Marvel.
Yeah.
Mr. Muscle Mike Marvel. I can't even say his name. Well, let's get to the spider's web. George, we're going to have you kick us off here and read the first one since you're our guest. It's only proper to do so.
Well, I'm looking through these, and let's see.
There's some long ones in here.
Yeah, all of these have addresses with them, so you wonder if they're actual people. I think I read somewhere that they made up some of these letters.
Oh, really?
Oh, really?
Oh, no, don't say that.
Maybe.
We've been guessing that on this show. We've always wondered, because they all sound like they were written by Stan Lee.
Yeah.
Stan, you're so great and cool and handsome.
Well, they just have his voice.
Yeah.
Well, I'll read this because it has to do with the issue that I got the first part of and then missed the second part. And
Spoilers.
Dear Stan and Steve, Spider-Man 26 was a masterpiece. The quality of your stories is beginning to rise after a sharp drop between numbers 6 to 24. Really? The Man in the Crime Master's mask was as good as number 9 and 10, my favorites. Even the art was good. There weren't any turned-up feet. I don't know what that means. Maybe he didn't like the way they were drawing feet. But the main reason I was truly overjoyed was the fact that the story had a plot to it. Issues 16 to 24 had no real plots except for numbers 18 to 20. All there were in these issues were fights, with Spider-Man winning. I know this isn't Stan's fault. He has to write so many scripts each month that he's doing very well managing to get all the stories out. But for real Marvel magic, Spider-Man 26 can't be topped. And the response here is, oh no, what did you think of 27, 28, and 29, eh, Tom?
I like how you have a long letter than just kind of a short hand. Yeah, whatever, Tom.
Okay, numbers 9 and 10. The Enforcers, I think, were number 9. I don't remember what Spider-Man number 10 was.
We always...
Issues 16 to 24, the Chameleon, maybe. I know there was the
Kraven the Hunter was in
there was a Green Goblin storyline where Spider-Man was running away,
yeah,
and he disappeared, and he was afraid to get into battle because he might get hurt, and then Aunt May wouldn't.
Aunt May's always holding him back.
Yeah, and so that was an interesting storyline that they had going on there. I don't know what this guy's talking about. A sharp drop between 6 to 24, because they introduced some characters there.
Yeah.
And then he complains about feet. Get over it, dude.
And they had a Dr. Octopus story. I think maybe that was 10 and 11, maybe.
Was that the one where he's on a boat?
I think so.
Yeah.
Where he's on the boat. So.
Now, did you read these the mail in the back when you picked these up when you were a kid? I imagine a kid. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'd look through them and see what they were.
Because when James told me about doing this podcast, I was like, "Come on, can it be that interesting?" And then I read some of them. And it's like, "Oh my god, these people they're 12 cents. Why are you complaining about something that's 12 cents?"
Well, this letter I just read is from Tommy Hickman in Tulia, Texas. So
there you go.
We need to point that out. But they all have addresses. They all talk about Spider-Man number 26, which was the Crime Master, which was a pretty good story. Mm-hmm. And it took me several years to finally read part 2 until they finally reprinted it.
Dang it.
And then I picked up number 28, which was the first appearance of the Molten Man, which was a good story.
Yeah, we read that one.
And interesting cover on that book, too. That was a very striking cover.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost kind of like dark like this cover on this mag.
Yeah.
But very... where was I going with this? Oh, James.
You want me to read one?
I want you to read one, James.
All right. Let's see. I'm just going to do the first one. Dear Stan and Steve, I quit reading comic books about 5 years ago, but one day last summer, I accidentally discovered Spider-Man. He was so different from superheroes that I was used to reading that I couldn't believe it. I tried the rest of the group and am now a fan of all your costume crime busters. All I can say about Stan Lee's writing is that it is the greatest. What I'm really interested in, though, is the artwork, since I'm an art major and an aspiring cartoonist. My favorites are Steve Ditko and Wally Wood. I have a couple of complaints about Steve, though. I don't really like the way he draws females. Sometimes they are all right, like that white-haired chick in Doctor Strange, but other times they're not. In Spidey number 24, Liz Allen looks like a 30-year-old woman in a couple of panels.
What does that mean?
I also wish that Flash Thompson would change his sweater and that Betty and Liz would develop better taste in clothes. Other than that,
is this from a guy?
Steve Ditko is terrific. Jack Kirby is a master at drawing super scientific machinery, exotic locales, and fight scenes, but his figures sometimes fail to satisfy. His best work is in Tales of Asgard. Don Heck and Bob Powell do very good illustrating. Keep up the good work because, in my humble opinion, Marvel is the best company in the business. And that's Larry Goka from Michigan State University. I really like this snotty little kid telling these guys.
And 30-year-old women are insulted everywhere.
Yeah. Wow.
30's not that old. Sheesh.
And then I like how he said, keep up the good work, but then he bashes him the whole first part of the letter. Good.
It is funny, though, when you read these, how, demeaning these guys are to women back then. Here's what Stan has to say. That's no humble opinion, Larry. You've just proven that you know the best when you see it, boy. But one thing's bugging us. You didn't say what business.
Boom.
Best company in what business?
What's funny is, since you said there was a rumor that went around that maybe they were writing these, I was thinking maybe this is Stan complaining about one of the artists. your women suck, but he's doing it inadvertently. It's like, hey, you should read this letter. Maybe you should do something about this. We've been getting complaints.
Well, I heard there was a kind of a falling out between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko over the Green Goblin, over his identity. I think Stan wanted it to be someone who was known, who was already introduced in the book, and Ditko wanted it to be just some guy. And in fact, that's how they did the Crime Master.
Yeah. Really?
I don't want to spoil that too much for anyone who hasn't read it, but that's something I read that Ditko wanted it to be just some guy.
Wow.
And Stan said, "Are you crazy? It's got to be somebody they've met before." And then they end up introducing a character, and then 2 issues later, he's revealed as the Green Goblin, which not much of a
right.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a certain amount of suspense in his identity for a while, but then you didn't actually meet the character.
I think that's a good plan to have it be somebody known. I think it gives it more. You care about it a little bit more, especially if you know who it is, and then Spider-Man doesn't know who it is, so you can kind of see the back and forth, and I find that that could have been a whole different.
Well, it kind of was because, like he said, Norman Osborn was just recently introduced, 2 issues before his reveal. Mm-hmm. So when it is revealed, it's like, oh, it's Harry's dad.
I mean, but they still gave it a couple issues to let it sink in.
Yeah, and they did introduce Harry in issue 31.
Okay, so I think it's to have a name to it that already. I think is smart to help sell comics.
So there was a little tie into it there, but they could have introduced Norman and then let maybe 5 to 10 issues go by before revealing him.
No, I had heard that. I don't know if this is true, or maybe it was just a rumor at the time, was that Ned Leeds was at least rumored to be the Goblin at the time.
They revealed him as the Hobgoblin,
The Hobgoblin, yeah.
later, much later, but then they took that back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that turned out to be
Oops.
turned out to be
A fashion designer.
well, yeah.
Hello.
I don't remember how they explained it, but I guess it wasn't Ned Leeds after all, and he was with the book pretty early.
Yeah.
I can't remember when
He's in this issue, actually.
Yeah, he's mentioned in
He's
issue 30. Well,
really early.
and I can't remember when he was first introduced, but he was introduced as kind of a rival for Peter, for Betty's affections with Peter, and
Women.
so that you had that triangle going in the early stories, that soap opera going in the pages of Spider-Man for a while, and then this is like the turning point. This issue 30. In issue 31, he starts college, meets new people, gets off to a rough start, and little do you know what happens with a lot of these characters down the road. And Mary Jane Watson, she's first mentioned, I think, in issue 14 or 15.
Yeah.
15, Craven the Hunter, mentioned by name. And she makes some appearances, but you never see her face. And so you never meet her until issue 42, which is like 3.5 years into the book.
And I think we did that when her first appearance, didn't we?
We showed it, but we didn't
Okay,
do
that's
that
right. That's
particular
right. That's
issue.
right. Yeah. Here's this girl. Go.
Oh wait, we did do that.
Did
That
we
was
do?
the
Okay.
It
Because he
wasn't-
graduated.
It
Was it
didn't
the
show her
graduation
face.
one?
Yeah, it didn't show her
Oh.
face. That was
Okay.
the joke.
That's right.
But yeah, it took him 3 years to finally introduce the character, and that's kind of strange.
And then you find out much later that she knew that Peter was Spider-Man even before he told her. I mean, almost from the beginning, because she saw Spider-Man come out of Peter's house when she was young, and put 2 and 2 together. And so when she's
So all those years,
all this stuff, when she first meets Peter and then they start going out together, you know, she knows who he is, but they don't reveal that.
I know you're secret.
That's kind of like a background.
that kind of doesn't make sense, though, does it? Like,
Not-
because like it seemed like she didn't know, unless she was just really acting well.
No, I think there were a couple of times maybe when she let him go off thinking he was,
yeah.
and you're thinking, oh, she knows he's going to take news photos for the Bugle. But
In reality.
in reality,
Interesting.
but she was the party girl who wasn't too serious too, and
Yeah.
I think that turned out to be a cover for some family problems that she had, which we won't talk about, but they go into much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, it's a soap opera.
It's a big soap opera.
Speaking of soap operas, this next letter, I was looking ahead here. Dear Stan and Steve, you're beginning to turn Spider-Man into a love mag! Exclamation point. I'm not against love, but it takes up half the mag. Let me give you an example. Liz, hello, Petey. Goodbye, Peter. Petey, your tie's crooked. I'm sorry, my eyes are going. Your tie's crooked, Petey. Peter, hello, Liz. Meet Betty Brant. Of course. Liz, sure. Betty, hello, Miss Allen. Yes, we've met. Goodbye. Miss Allen, yeesh. In Spider-Man number 25, the action didn't start until page 11. That's pretty far to read before you find some excitement. So I'm for more love, I'm for action. No, I'm sorry, for no more love, I'm for action. And that's from Carrie Burt, who we don't know if it's a man or a woman, from Mishawaka, Indiana. And Stan or Steve reply, listen, Carrie, any guy who thinks that hello, Petey, your tie's crooked, meet Betty Brant, goodbye, Miss Allen, represents love, you would certainly prefer action. So we're with you all the way, pal. I think it's funny that he agrees with most of the people that criticize him.
Well, that's like the kids, you know, they don't want all this romantic mush. They want action.
Yeah.
They want to see the hero.
Which makes sense. I mean, maybe even like have 2 pages of action and then you kind of go into the mush and then you end with the action, you know, like
Yeah.
a nice action sandwich.
Well, these stories were pretty much all soap opera. I mean, Dr. Octopus would come in as a distraction just so that, like, get you away from but that's pretty much what they were like love stories.
Well, you look at Thor, too, with Don Blake and Jane
Yeah.
Foster, and then Odin not approving of Jane Foster and not approving of having a mortal involved with his son, and then so you got the whole family turmoil and dynamic going on there, and that was a real soap opera that was going for quite a while.
Yeah. Poor Thor. No.
Did they ever, just offhand, because I've been reading some, they kind of downplay the Don Blake persona after a while, right?
Yeah, they did, and I haven't collected Thor regularly over the years to know exactly what they did. I think they had Don Blake off in this Arctic wilderness, and he falls into a cave and discovers the hammer of Thor, and he finds out that he can hold it, and he taps it on the ground. It turns into his walking stick, and then if he taps it again, he becomes Thor, and it turns into the hammer. So there's a mystical quality to it, but you know, why Don Blake? And I think they came up later with an explanation that Thor did something and his punishment was to be sent to Earth as Don Blake, and he forgot who he was.
Okay, yeah.
And this, they went back and explained that much later, because you'd think Don Blake would have parents on Earth. How could he be the son of Odin?
Yeah.
And
where's this guy?
Where's all this coming from?
Yeah.
So,
Is
this?
Are they two different people?
Are they two different people inhabiting the same body on Earth, or you know, does Thor suddenly inhabit Don Blake?
Yeah. I tried reading a Thor, and I don't get it. I got lost.
One of the
older
early
dudes?
ones?
Yeah. I don't,
Oh yeah, they're very different.
They were pretty simplistic, like a lot of comic books were, early 60s. And then as they got going, they really started developing their characters and their stories. And Thor really got into some good stories there in the mid to late 60s. And when they introduced the Destroyer, the
See,
character.
I need to go back to the 60s then, because
there were some great stories involving, and some villains like the Grey Gargoyle and the Cobra and Mr. Hyde, who I think were separate villains, and then they teamed up. And then, of course, you had the Asgardian villains, the Enchantress and the Executioner, and all these.
Oh yeah.
And they really created a world of characters with Thor, and then of course you have the romantic dynamic that's playing out, and eventually Jane Foster leaves, and I think that sets the stage for Sif to come in and be the new love interest, and I think much later they figured, oh, we've got to go back and try to explain this whole Don Blake thing.
Yeah. We owe it to the
And they're
fans.
like, this never really did make sense, did it?
Or you get a young writer who wants to come in and say, okay, let's retell this story and
Which
go
I
into
think
it.
is sometimes a good thing, because then you get something you can start out with. Like they're doing that even with the newer comics. They're retelling like with Iron Man, you know, they redid his kind of origin story, which
and
I think more people can
updated it.
identify with. Yeah.
Yeah, and DC's done that a few times also. Well, but with
They
the
do
new
that,
52, they pretty much updated the characters.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and they do a good job, like even in the 80s with Crisis, they do a good job of reinventing them. I think they do that more than Marvel does, it seems like.
Yeah, I've never read the Crisis books, but
Yeah.
just heard a little bit about them
Yeah.
here and there. But
I need to read them too. So.
But the thing about it is, sometimes I don't like it when they tamper with history, with the history of the character, and they try to rewrite it. And they've done that a couple of times, like the Clone Saga in Spider-Man. That almost put me off comic books.
Don't get
I
James
thought,
started on the clones.
I thought, okay, they're regressing. They're writing for 12-year-olds again. They've stopped growing up. Maybe it's time to finally stop and just enjoy the classics from the 60s and 70s. And of course I think they brought some other writers in and they had to fix it, and they did it by resurrecting a character that was long dead. And so all of this, and then there was another Spider-Man story that I think Straczynski had something to do with that.
I know what you're
Sins
talking
of the
about.
Past.
Yep.
And I did not like that concept at all. That's tampering with history. We didn't. If you want to go back and add a few more details to kind of flesh out the story and flesh out the characters, fine. But don't tamper with the big progression of events and the big stuff. And it's almost like a young writer coming in and trying to redo something that a previous writer did, and it's like, okay,
Cool it.
Yeah.
buddy, why?
Yeah.
They did it right the first time. You don't need to go in and correct it.
And why did somebody not stop him? I don't know. There's fans out here, then there's people that actually did it, like Stan Lee, and to let him do that, I can't imagine why.
I tend to think Spider-Man is kind of, since he was for a long time the only really popular Marvel, he was kind of their punching bag character, where they would do just, to get sales up, they would do shocking storylines that were just horrible.
Yeah.
And for 90s and the 2000s, they did that.
Well, they had a storyline going where he was homeless for a time.
What?
And he could have gone to his Aunt May's house. He ended up being homeless. They had another story where he tried stand-up comedy, where Peter Parker tried stand-up comedy. And it's like, okay, we want the amazing Spider-Man, not the pathetic Spider-Man. And then Marvel paints themselves in a corner with the Clone Saga, and they have to correct it. And then they have Civil War, where he reveals his identity, where Spider-Man tells the world he's Peter Parker. Okay, what happens now?
Yeah, and they could never figure out.
And that ended up in Brand New Day, which was good in some ways, but not so good the way they executed it.
Yeah.
And they brought in a character who had no business being in Spider-Man books. And I think they had a way they could have done it with their Secret Invasion miniseries. I would have had, maybe the Skrulls build this device that is going to mentally enslave everyone on Earth. Heroes get to it, they damage it, but they don't stop it from going off, and it causes everybody to lose their memory of Civil War. So that's how you remask Spider-Man.
I like that.
That's way better.
I ought to write.
That makes sense to me.
I'm going to go to New York and write comic books.
You might as well.
But that could have been an easy out
Fix,
for 'em.
yeah.
Instead of going to this Brand New Day thing, which they've kind of slipped on and forgotten about. They did have some interesting stories, I think, that went through that.
Yeah, and even with Brand New Day, like, you lose, like, even though it's nice that they wipe the slate clean of all the crap, but then you lose he and Mary Jane are no longer married anymore, right?
That's correct.
And, what is it with them and that character? Like, for the past 20 years, they've been trying to either kill her off or do something, and it's like, if it's so hard for you to write
For women
or for married couples or whatever, then why don't you just have them get a divorce?
That's a whole arc right there.
I think that was a question they were asking on the letters page at one time. Should Peter and Mary Jane divorce?
Daredevil could be his divorce attorney.
But a lot of these Marvel characters, you mentioned Daredevil, and a lot of them are hard luck characters, and they have problems that are caused by their other identity, and it does make for some interesting storylines, but sometimes they need to think it through maybe a little more carefully, and not try to cause an upheaval. I almost wonder if that was an outgrowth. You had the death of Superman in the early 90s, and then you had the Age of Apocalypse storyline in X-Men. Mm-hmm. And it got the writers in a mindset that we need to have some upheaval, some major catastrophe upheaval that just totally messes everything up.
Yeah.
But eventually they have to go back to the status quo, and that creates too much of a mess.
Yeah.
And
unless you have a really good writer that can get around that, which I think they're kind of getting to now with the new 52.
I don't think Marvel is. Oh, yeah.
The new
okay,
52. They've
okay.
got some pretty solid stories, with what I've been picking up with, like, Scott Snyder and Jeff Johns. They do a tremendous job of writing. And people like that, I think, you could take something like that and fix it. And you get a brain trust going. And I think that's what they're doing with the 52, which is why I'm still with it. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, with Marvel, maybe they should throw a bunch of money at them.
Well, and another part of it is they want to sell more books, and there are fewer people reading comic books these days, and a lot of older people are, but I don't know that kids are so much. And so maybe that's a concern for the future, and they're starting to put comics out on the internet, digital comics. Yeah. That may be the way to go in the future. You wonder, And talking about books, Enrique, that you mentioned earlier, I like to have the feel of a book in my hand. I don't want to do everything on the internet,
Yeah.
or have everything digitally. It's nice in some ways, but it's better to have that book too,
Yeah,
that you
exactly.
can hold in your hand and thumb through the pages and read and reread it.
Exactly.
And the Kindles are great, and they might be great for having a lot of the classics, but
And there's something
it's still
like,
good to have a book.
Exactly. I like going on my lunch break from work and going down to the comic book shop and poking around a little bit, and I like that. It's a nice escape for about an hour, and it's something I can do at home. And even if I'm not reading, I can go downstairs and look at them and rearrange them in whatever order I want them in. And just think there's something to be said that they should still be churning out these comic books every month. So
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't go away.
Yeah, that's quite a task to be writing a story every month,
Oh, yeah.
and drawing it and putting it together, and you're under, deadline pressure, and it's probably amazing that a lot of the stories are as good as they are, with having to churn one out so often.
Exactly.
And that reminds me of another series of books I saw growing up in the 60s when I'd go into grocery stores and drugstores and look at the paperback stands. I would see the Doc Savage books, and they had striking covers. An artist named James Bama would draw these covers. He drew like the first 62
Oh, wow.
books. And these were pulp magazines. They were sold in the 30s. The first Doc Savage came out in 1933, and the last one in 1948. There are 181 Doc Savage stories, mostly written by a guy named Lester Dent, who lived in Ponca City, Oklahoma at one time, lived in Tulsa, and then he goes to New York to write pulp fiction, write for pulp magazines for Street and Smith. And these were like little novels, and they'd publish these, and they were called pulps because their paper was made from wood pulp. That's where that came from. So 10 cents, you could buy a Doc Savage magazine. They had interesting artwork on the covers. They'd have 2 or 3 short stories with them, and Lester Dent had to churn out one of these novels every month.
Yeah.
And sometimes he had other writers come in and write. Maybe he'd come up with a story, but another writer, or maybe 6 or 7 other writers that wrote for this book. But every month they had to put this magazine out, and there were other pulp magazines too. They're printing these again, a company
wow.
called Sanctum Books, and they put 2 in each book. It's a soft cover, and they reproduce the magazine covers on the back, and the front
wow.
the front cover has one of the magazine covers, and on the back you can see both of them from both stories. And sometimes they have 3 stories in them. They're up to like number 67 now in Doc Savage. So when they get into the 90s, they'll have run through the whole series. The thing is, they're not printing these in the same order that they came out originally. So if you want the first 2 Doc Savage stories, you're going to have to pick up book number 14. In that. And
That drives me nuts.
The Shadow is another one that they're
Yeah,
putting
yeah,
out, and there were like 300 issues of The Shadow on pulp.
Well, they're even putting
magazines.
those out, and I've seen the Shadow on the shelves over at Prairie Dog. And
Yeah.
they're doing Bionic Man, and I want to pick it up, but I'm still kind of iffy about it. The Kolchak the Night Stalker, which is actually a show that when the Sci-Fi Channel would do, like during the day, I'd watch Kolchak the Night Stalker because he reminded me of a guy here at work. I won't say his name because I don't want to get in trouble. It reminds me of Chris Frank. I said it. But I would watch that, and then I liked it because it was like a I don't know if people watch Supernatural that listen to this. It's kind of like a reporter that goes out and he doesn't fight vampires, but he does like investigative journalism. And, he's one of those guys that goes to his boss. There's vampires out there. And he's like, "You're crazy, Kolchak. No, you got to listen to me." And then no one listens to him. And at the end, he's left alone with a dead vampire or whatever. But that magazine's out, and I've seen a Bionic Man, and there's all sorts of, like, Flash Gordon came out. They did some of those, and which is fun. I did pick up a couple of those, and those are pretty interesting. So, but it's always nice to see some of the older stuff come back, and people, trying to redo them and revamp them and make them look nice. And
I didn't know there was a Lone Ranger magazine that was out in the pulp era, and they're reprinting some of those stories too.
I did see some of those, yeah.
And a very different look for the Lone Ranger if you look at some of those covers. Doesn't look like Clayton Moore at all. It looks kind of rough around the edges there.
Gristled old cowboy. And I imagine it's because of the movie that's coming. Is it this summer?
Yeah,
I
this
think
summer.
This summer, yeah, with Johnny Depp, and Johnny Depp could sell anything right now. So,
Oh, yeah.
but well, George, I think we got time for a couple more letters. If you want to do another one for us.
Okay, let's pick another one here. Well, this goes back to what we were talking about with the cover. Dear Stan and Steve, just a note to compliment you on the amazing Spider-Man. From the very first, it has been your best effort in the present era of pop art magazines.
Ooh.
I am now working on the Dew line in Alaska, in an area which is just about as isolated as any spot on the earth. Because of my remote location, I have to subscribe to all your marvelous mags. There are just not enough supermarkets on Dew line sites. Well, so long, gang. I just received my MMMS kit, and I have to go listen to that crazy record. Ronald Dickinson of Fairbanks, Alaska. And the response, hope you enjoy it, Ron, although for any guy who'd subscribe to all our mags, we ought to get Spidey to go up north and recite it to you personally.
Wow, that'd be nice if he was real. No, that's me. Well, it's a funny thing he said about MMS. You're the one who actually told us about that, and you got us excited because someone else other than our friends were listening to the podcast, and so that got us excited. Oh, he listened to it. All right, we got a fan, and then that kind of got us to keep going.
Merry Marvel Marching Society. I never sent off for that kit, but it sounds like they got a little record that came with it, and that had a lot of interesting stuff in it. They've got books out there you can pick up, the Marvel Vault and the Spider-Man Vault, that have reproductions of some of this stuff.
Oh, wow.
That you can pull out. It's
That's cool.
kind of neat to see those books that they have artifacts in that you can pull out and look at.
I would love to look at those. We were talking about we'd join if they redid it. We'd probably join up.
I'd join, yeah.
Yeah. Just to get a button or something would be fun.
Oh yeah.
To do. Excuse me, James. You want to do another letter for us, sir?
Yeah. Let's see.
Not that one.
It'll be the one following that one.
Okay.
Spidey, dear Stan and Steve, Spidey 26 was your best effort yet. There was not a fault in the entire book. I will dissect it to show you what I mean. First, the cover. It was forcefully dramatic, and I was glad that you didn't ruin it by plastering it with, mighty Marvel wisecracks and slogans. Next, the artwork. It was beautifully drawn. My favorite artwork panels were on pages 12, 13, and 19. Thirdly, I don't know if that's a word. Thirdly, the plot. It was stupendous. The idea of a superhero who has no costume and has to buy one at a costume store is deliciously different. I am glad to see that Peter proved he wasn't an egghead when he attacked the group of boys on page 7. Liz's getting mad at Peter is good, since it will prevent further competition between Liz and Betty. So, in the mighty Marvel tradition, I will utter those romantic words while a trio of spiders play violins.
Wow.
Enough said. And that's from Andrew Goldwasser from New Jersey. The response, enough said. Whatever on earth does that mean?
That's one of those phrases you heard a lot from Stan Lee in the books. Enough said. Excelsior.
We went through a couple of these. What was another one?
I can't remember. There was like Face Front.
Yeah.
Face Front, True Believers.
Yeah.
Mags. Referring to Mags. Next-ish.
I do like that issue he's talking about, though, when he has to buy... That actually lasts for, like, a couple issues where he's wearing the store-bought costume.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and
the police couldn't track that down, like, go to the costume stores. Anyone buy a Spider-Man costume recently? Yeah, this guy. And track him down, arrest him. Well, he'd probably get away, but still.
And it kept
Never mind.
falling apart, so we had to web it together.
Well, we're coming up on the last few minutes here. George, I wanted to ask you what you thought, since you're a Spider-Man fan, I take it. What did you think of the last movie that just came out? And have you seen any of the pictures from the next one?
I have not seen the last movie yet. That's still one I've got to see. I've seen some pictures from the next one. They had a picture of Paul Giamatti as the Rhino. Looks interesting. Maybe I wonder if that's an early shot. it's kind of interesting. He's got that line across his forehead, and I don't know what that means.
Looks like a Stitches tattoo or a Bob Wire tattoo, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Electro is supposed to be one of the other villains, and it'll be interesting to see. As they always reimagine these characters and redo them, it looks like they've gone back more to the traditional Spider-Man costume for this new movie. I think the first one was designed by Cirque du Soleil.
Oh, really?
From what I read,
I hated the blue fingertips.
Yeah, it was very different. It still, basically followed the original.
Well, I also read that he, and this is weird, but he was completely nude under the costume. So
Andrew Garfield was?
Okay. And he had to get into some great shape to fit in that and make it look right, and that he felt weird and awful every time you see him in the costume, he's doesn't feel right. So.
Yeah. that's he really had to do the body sculpting, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Now did you see Iron Man 3?
Yes.
You did?
I did see that.
What did you think of it?
It was a very good movie. It didn't seem to me at all like it was a lead-in to Phase 2 of the Marvel movies. It was like an interlude between. And all this build-up over the Mandarin, and then...
Spoilers.
Oops.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was kind of funny, and it was kind of disappointing in a way, too.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And...
Because I felt robbed of... Because reading some of the comic books, the Mandarin had these awesome rings that we didn't get to see used, and they were even in the trailer. There was a shot of them in the movie. There's all right, he's going to do something with those, and then nothing.
Well, I wasn't too disappointed on that because the Mandarin really wasn't that great of a villain anyway in the comics, but I was more disappointed about Ben Kingsley.
Well, I think they're concerned about stereotypes and all that, and they want to be careful with that. And I think they didn't think about that much in the 60s when they created this character. He was kind of a big villain for Iron Man in the comics, and that was another comic I lived to get every month. It was Tales of Suspense with Iron Man and Captain America, and 10 pages of story, but they packed a lot into those 10 pages for each character. And the Mandarin had some of the more interesting stories. But then, again, they had a lot of different villains. Somebody wrote an article on the internet that talked about how similar the 3 Iron Man movies were in storyline, and how Tony Stark essentially is fighting another industrialist or inventor. And it's not like they've brought some other villain out from another arena
realm
to take him on. And this looked like that was going to be it, and didn't turn out that way. So, but it was a very good movie, and it had a lot of action in it and some change of pace stuff.
I liked it a lot better the second time, I think, after I knew the plot twist was coming. But I liked, the kid and everything, even though that's a cliche. It's a cliche I've never seen in a superhero movie. So.
They used the kid very well in this movie. And then this movie has had good characters. I mean, they brought in characters from the comic book, and they translated very well. Pepper and Happy, but there was no Shield, no mention of Shield in this movie. That was kind of something that was missing. I think, and I don't understand why people didn't like Iron Man 2 that much. I liked it quite a bit.
I rewatched it. It's a pretty good movie.
And I think I would have given the first 2 movies like 3.5 stars, and this one 3.
Yeah.
Still a good movie. They could have done more with it.
Right, and I think comic book movies have a knack for, like the Batman movies, taking a villain and making him something more than what the comic book made them. Like for Bane, for example, they gave him a lot more background and character, and something to work on. Like even in the comic books, it can leak into the comic books, which it hasn't yet, but I've read that it's gonna come. So, but I felt that way with the Mandarin, that they were gonna do that, take that character that not a lot of people knew about, make him into something not exactly what the comic book was, but make him different into the same person but a different character, and
he's a completely different character.
Right, exactly. Now he was, exactly. So it's Guy Pearce with dragon tattoos and I don't know, fire. I don't know how to explain that, but that's what I was hoping for. So, well, George, thanks again. That's been about our hour for us. I mean, we could probably go on for days talking about comic books and movies and everything comics. Did you have anything you wanted to end on that you wanted to talk about?
Well, it's been a lot of fun, guys, to talk with you. I hope I get to come back sometime. And
Oh, definitely.
There's a whole world of things we can talk about. I've touched on the movie serials. I want to talk about them a little bit and talk about some other things that were part of the '60s and things that we continue to enjoy today. And
exactly, because James and I can only poke fun at it through, our crude DVD ROMs or whatever. So, I mean, to actually have somebody that was there collecting and growing up during the time, I think adds a huge dynamic to the podcast. So I'm glad I ran into you, and I'm glad that you wanted to do the podcast with us.
Well, I was looking at the Mighty Marvel checklist here, and it's interesting just to look at these issues. Sergeant Fury is another book I grew up reading. It'd be hard to find letters from that, but that's another classic Marvel book, and it only lasted a little over 100 issues and got into reprints. And I think war comic books kind of went out of fashion after a while. DC had Sergeant Rock, and
that made a little bit of a comeback in the New 52, but I think that's died down.
Yeah, and it's like war comics aren't so popular anymore, but there was a real spirit in Sergeant Fury that was going for a while, and then I think the Vietnam War kind of had an impact on that, and really took out its popularity. And then they took that character and made him Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Great stories there, but they've had a hard time sustaining that book, and there have been several versions of it over the years. But the original stories were really good and still have a lot of value today to be rediscovered, hopefully, by younger audiences, younger readers.
And that's what we hope to do with this, get people reading the older ones, because I'm starting to pick up whatever James gives me. I'll at least read what James gives me, and it's completely different from what it is now, so it's definitely a must. So
George, thanks again. We do want to have you back, if that's okay.
Yes, I would love to come back, and we can get into some other areas, other topics, and like I mentioned, movie serials, but there are classic TV shows and things like that
it'd
we
be
can
fun.
get into.
Yeah, exactly.
And
cool.
It's been fun reminiscing.
Yeah,
exactly. It's fun learning. So I'm going to nickname you the Professor.
well, Professor X.
Professor X. There we go. Professor G.
Well, I guess we're about out of time then.
Yeah.
We'll probably just wrap it up. But like I said, we do want to have you back, and we'll try to get this posted
whenever I get a chance.
Yeah.
So. And that's it. Our thing is going to switch here in any minute now. We're just going to wait it out.
Thank you, true believers.
Thank you.
Thank you.